Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this Insight series, which is the first of two that launches our new headline theme, Signals. So in this session, I'm first of all just going to give a little bit of some background about how we have developed our headline theme, and then I'm going to hand over to our two presenters today, Chris Hassell and Ali Walsh, who were actually fundamental in helping us develop this, unknowingly to them, I think, at the time, but we'll explain that story. So once Chris and Ali have both spoken for about 15 minutes, we'll then open the floor for questions and discussion. And then at the end of the session, we'll be able to share with you the link to the website and the programme that we are putting in place for our headline theme, which will give you some ideas of how you can engage with us on this if it's of interest. So to start, I'm just going to explain a little bit about how we came to Signals. So the Horizons Institute, as you know, is a institute at the university to develop early stage interdisciplinary research. And in 2023, we had a headline theme called What Comes After the SDGs, which allowed us to develop research and discussion across campus linked to that topic. The headline theme we had was really interesting, very successful. We had some interesting research come out from those activities. So we wanted to launch another headline theme, but this time we wanted to consult across the university about what that theme might be. And the primary objective of this theme is to really bring together people from right across different areas of campus to have conversations that they maybe wouldn't have with people that they maybe wouldn't meet, and develop ideas and research within a very broad theme that would allow people to come together and access this from their relevant disciplines. So we began this process by having a consultation with the faculty pro-deans and directors of the interdisciplinary research centres and institutes. And from them, we had some really interesting conversations about topics and areas of research within their remits that were maybe less well established, areas that fell between some of the commonly shared research strengths at the university, where there might be gaps and where there might be opportunities for new research avenues. We took all the topics that we were given and looked at how frequently they came up across campus to try and draw out the topics that were really common between different disciplines. And using some, we did some analysis of those topics and started to come out with some cross-cutting themes that we thought might bring people together. From that, we developed some working titles, and we took those titles to some workshops that we were running as part of one of our programs in South Africa. Chris and Ali were both at those workshops and were in a group that responded to our request for them to develop a research project linked to the title Security for the Future. And through their discussions, they came up with an amazing project idea, but introduced us to the concept of flickering, which is an ecological phenomenon where the animals exhibit behaviours where they flicker in between states. Chris is going to explain this much better than me in a moment, I'm sure. But it serves as a sort of indication of a tipping point or a regime change or a shift in environment through their behaviour. And we really like this concept, and we took that and thought about how we could frame that in a way that might be accessible across disciplines at the university. And from that, we developed our headline theme, which is Signals: Detecting, Predicting and Responding to Uncertainty. So this headline theme, as it says there, is about sparking and developing cross-cutting interdisciplinary conversations. And we've pulled together a programme of work that we hope will enable everyone right across the university, but also externally, to engage with the theme and have some conversations, as I said, that they wouldn't normally have with people they wouldn't normally meet. So to launch this, we've dedicated our insight session today and our next one in July to talking about signals and what they mean to different researchers in their own disciplines, and then bringing that together to think about the opportunity for interdisciplinary collaboration. So I am delighted to welcome Dr. Chris Hassell and Professor Ali Walsh to the session today to talk about what signals means in their disciplines. Chris is going to speak first. Chris is Associate Professor of Animal Biology here at the University of Leeds, and I'm going to hand over to him for the next 15 minutes. Thank you, Chris.
Great, thanks very much, Kate. Can you see the slides there? Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk to you today. It was a strange offhand comment in a workshop on the other side of the world that I guess led Ali and I to being invited to speak at this event. What I'll try to do is explain where this idea for flickering came from in my mind and where it sits within my discipline of ecology, conservation biology. I'll say it's a little broader than ecology and conservation. It's got roots also in financial analysis, in linguistic and cultural analysis in some settings as well as in physics and chemistry. And I'll touch on some of those towards the end of the talk. And I'll try to explain why I've got this title about flickering insects in aeroplanes. Briefly, my disciplinary background is as an entomologist, an ecologist studying global change. And so I'm really interested in how the environment changes, how we understand that change, and how we design interventions to try to mitigate some of the problems that we cause in nature. And we have a long history of trying to do this. Here you can see a plot from quite an influential paper from Georgina Mace and colleagues almost a decade ago, which it's developed this idea of bending a biodiversity curve. And so here you can see the biodiversity curve, the biodiversity index, which might be the number of species or the number of individuals of a species, is declining. That black line is these observed trends. And what you can see is various international agreements on how we might be able to slow that rate of decline. The Convention on Biological Diversity there, which talked about developing national strategies. The Convention on the Parties, the Conference of the Parties 6, which was all about setting deadlines by which we would achieve a significant reduction in the current rate of biodiversity loss. And then the Aichi targets, which set out diversity targets to again slow or reverse the trends in biodiversity loss. Suffice it to say, none of that has had that much of an effect, although the different multicolored lines, dotted lines towards the end of the plot, indicate some of the range of potential outcomes that we might be able to have if we were to act in certain ways, some of which do involve bending the biodiversity curve back up, and we see nature recovery. The problem we face is that biodiversity decline doesn't really look like this. It looks a little bit more like this. So this is a conceptual diagram showing how ecosystems change through different levels of damage or degradation. And so on the left-hand side, we call this a sort of ball and cup model for thinking about resilience, and other disciplines use this metaphor as well. On the left-hand side, we have these desirable ecosystem states. So these are species might be shifting around, but broadly, the ecosystem is functional, it's coherent. As you move to the right, these balls can hop from one cup to the next if they're pushed by environmental stresses like pollution or climate change, and they enter a different state. And these might be states where you have altered species, yes, but you also start to lose function or change function. And what you'll note is that this trend from desirable to degraded involves a downward slope where it's harder to recover than it is to damage. And the way that we think about these kinds of shifts from one state to another, it influences the way we think about how we intervene. When systems are relatively intact, we want to maintain the resilience. And that's quite easy to do. The problem comes when we start to lose our system's integrity and we have to overcome unhelpful resilience. We have to dig ourselves out of a hole. So my talk here is going to be about how we think about biodiversity in nature in this kind of resilience context. Kate's already mentioned this idea of regimes or stable states. And I'll give you a couple of examples just to illustrate what we mean by that. Here we have a very famous experiment that David Schindler ran in the 1970s. This is in the experimental lakes area in northern Canada. It's often said that we can't do experiments in ecology because the scales at which we work are too grand. The experimental lakes area contains hundreds of lakes across a remote area of Canada where these experiments really can be carried out. And David Schindler famously poured phosphorus into one bay of this lake, keeping them separated by the little white line, which is a baffle in between the two bays, and showed that you can initiate a regime shift towards cyanobacterial dominated as opposed to clear water states when you add phosphorus. Now, what's important here is that when the system shifts, the algae, the cyanobacteria dominate, and it's very difficult to get rid of them because they blanket the surface of the water, they prevent the light getting to the plants that grow in the bottom, those plants die and then cannot re-establish. And so it is a very resilient system that's very difficult to recover from compared to the lower bay in the photo, which shows you what it looked like before. Perhaps more charismatic and more commonly talked about is the shift that's ongoing in coral reef systems. So again, on the left-hand side here, we have a lovely, pristine, coral-dominated reef. There's lots of what we call structural complexity, lots of three-dimensional structure, which is providing habitat for plants and animals, these fish that you can see. The fish are able then to graze down any algae that happens to settle, and it remains a coral-dominated resilient system. But if you start to have damage from heat waves or from storms, the three-dimensional structure is lost, the fish are lost, and the algae start to dominate. And that's what you have on the right. And again, similar to the lakes, when the algae dominate, they suppress the recovery of the coral. And again, you end up with a very resilient system, but not perhaps one that you might want. And a final example closer to my heart, some ponds. I love a good pond. They're fascinating little systems and extremely neglected compared to the lakes and coral reefs that I've shown you before. But this is an example of ecological recovery from one stable system to another. On the left hand, these are two pairs of photos. The top two are the same pond and the bottom two are the same pond. The top left shows the pond before restoration, where it's overgrown and filled in with silt and there's trees growing. And on the top right, you can see after all that's cleared, you get this wonderful open water pond again. Similarly, the bottom left is overgrown, almost grassland by this stage. But once more, you can recover that pond by scraping off the top surface and the plants come back. And what's fascinating about it is that you have within the sediment underneath that grass in the bottom left-hand photo, hundreds of years worth of seeds that are lying dormant, and they burst back into action when given the opportunity. So a good example of long-term ecological resilience of these ecosystems. And I want to flag that this is wonderful work done by Carl Sayer and the Norfolk Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group out in that part of the world. So where does flickering come in, though? Well, we have different types of resilience. We have high resilience systems where there's rapid recovery. It's very hard to shift these systems, as you can see in this illustration here, out of their current state. And there's a small chance of regime shift. The challenge comes where you have environmental stresses that make the cups less deep. They make the resilience lower. That makes it easier for the system to be pushed out of its equilibrium. It makes it slower to recover to that equilibrium, and it increases the probability of a shift to an alternative stable state. And so we get some consequences from this. The first is greater variability. The system starts to vary a lot more than it would if it was in a higher resilience state. You get slower recovery, which across different disciplines is referred to as critical slowing down. The system just seems sluggard in terms of the way that it's reacting to change. And as you approach that boundary between the regimes, you get this phenomenon of flickering, where you get oscillations around the regime boundary, where the system might rapidly change between those two alternative states. So this is all theory, it's all concept, but we do have evidence for this from a really notable Nature paper from a decade and a half ago. And this is what I had in my mind, this specific paper, when I was talking to Ali about flickering in Johannesburg. This is a study of cores, sediment cores from a Chinese lake. And specifically within those cores, the researchers were looking at these tiny but beautiful little single-celled organisms called diatoms. And you can see an image of what those look like. They're tiny little algae, but they form a silicon case, silicon shell that has many different colors and shapes and sizes. And in fact, it was a Victorian pastime for ladies of leisure to sit down with a microscope and arrange these into ornate patterns. So they have a cultural dimension as well. What you can see in these three figures is on the top, it's a complicated ecological analysis. All you need to know is that varying on the x-axis is time from the late 19th century through to the 21st century. And on the y-axis in that A plot is just a measure of the kinds of diatoms that are found. And you can see through time through to towards the end of the 20th century, those lines are pretty stable. It's a reasonably stable community. And then there's a sudden change around 2000. That's the regime change that happens. In B, you can see now, this is the degree of fluctuation in that community. And you can see that it's relatively stable again, but then starts to oscillate much more rapidly between 1970 and 2000. And that's shown in a different way in C, where you have the standard deviation, the measure of the variability in the community, which you can see ramps up monotonically. It ramps up continuously through to that transition point. And this is the detection of flickering in the ecological time series that could potentially be an early warning system for important and hard to reverse state transitions in ecosystems. So this is what I had in mind when I was talking about flickering and why I thought it could be applicable to a lot of other different systems. So why is flickering important though? And why on earth am I talking about aeroplanes? We have a hypothesis that we talk about in ecology and conservation called the rivet hypothesis. And this was a hypothesis put forward decades ago now, about how we think about the integrity of ecosystems. And it draws on this notion that aeroplane wings, if you're sat in an aeroplane flying somewhere, you want the wings to stay on the plane. That's a positive outcome. That's the stable state that we want to preserve. And that state is preserved through a series of small pieces of metal called rivets. These are what attach the plane, the wing to the fuselage. You have a lot more rivets than you need, and that's good because you want the plane to stay on. You want the plane and the wing to stay attached. And you can lose a few rivets and the wing will stay attached. The problem is that eventually you lose a critical rivet, and that's where the wing flies off. And it's very, very difficult to determine what the critical rivet or tipping point is for this catastrophic change. And we're at a state now with ecological science where we have a very complex system, and it's very difficult for us to predict how many species we can lose before ecosystems undergo a catastrophic and critical transition to a state that we don't want. So this is where aeroplanes and the metaphor of aeroplanes comes in. And when that transition happens, we get problems like desertification. It's very difficult to recover land from desert. We get flooding, where it's very difficult, again, to shore up land once it's been inundated, especially with seawater. We get a loss of biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. And sometimes, as shown in the bottom right-hand corner, we get too much of the wrong kind of biodiversity, like this locust swarm. So these kinds of states are not what we necessarily want to see. But there's challenges in biodiversity research in studying phenomena like flickering. I said at the start that flickering is not just an ecological phenomenon. It's found in other disciplines. It's found in financial markets, shown in the top left, where they get data every second on tens of thousands of different companies. There's been analyses of cultural change, linguistic change. A linguistic corpus now can draw from the internet and draw on terabytes of data again. And even the climate scientists, who aren't known for having huge amounts of data, have a lot more data than the biologists as a result of recent climate change initiatives funding and modeling and detection. Meanwhile, the ecologists are almost literally still walking around with butterfly nets catching bugs. Biodiversity is a very multifaceted and complex concept to try to describe, especially at the spatial and temporal scale and resolution that you need to generate useful data for this kind of analysis. So that's a big challenge. So where could we go to study ecological flickering in more detail? We have two options, and I'd suggest that these are certainly not mutually exclusive. The first is to think about old data sets we have access to and teach them new tricks. A good example of this is Charlie Outhwaite's work, looking at citizen science data going back half a century and applying new modeling approaches like occupancy modeling to understand trends and transitions in those populations that you can study. We have to continue doing that because these are the data we have, and we need to ensure continuity with older methods so that we have long-term data series. But the alternative, or the complement, would be new technologies, new methods. And those of you who know me will know I'm a great advocate for radar analysis to study biodiversity patterns. And this bottom right plot is an example of how we can get data every 5 minutes on insect populations across a particular area of the UK to try to generate this kind of high resolution data series. So just to wrap up then, I heard the timer ping. Ecosystems are complex and exhibit these different states. And the problem is that the resilience of those ecosystems is being weakened by environmental change. These ecosystems do flicker. We do see this, coral to algae, pond to grass, and clear water to algal. And when we see regime shifts, that's almost never going to be a good thing for people. And while flickering is hard to detect in data poor disciplines like my own, we're hoping that a combination of different analytical approaches and new technologies might help us to address these questions more comprehensively going forward. And that's where I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was very interesting, fascinating. I also like the comment, you want the wings to stay on the aeroplane. I've never really thought about that when I'm on a plane, but that is absolutely, definitely what we should be thinking. Right, I'm going to hand straight over to Ali, and then there's some questions in the chat already, but we'll take all the questions at the end. So Ali Walsh is a professor of performance and social change at the University of Leeds, and I'm going to hand over to her to talk about flickering and signals in her discipline. Thank you, Ali.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And Chris, I can already see some commonalities in what we're talking about, especially from the perspective of someone who's actually keen on regime change. So I like to think of myself as a scholar, artist, activist, and a methodologist rooted in interdisciplinarity and collaborative theatre making with communities about the issues that are important to them. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. But first, the example of the young woman Nonkaouse, who was immediately the figure that came to mind when I met Chris and when we started talking about flickering. So here we have a brief introduction to this young woman, Nonkaouse, who was an Eastern Xhosa woman who foresaw apocalyptic visions of the destruction of the Xhosa civilization back in 1856. There was widespread adoption of her prophecies, which led her community to destruction as she directed them to kill their cattle and burn their crops, as a result of which thousands of people starved to death, and there was an estimate of 40,000 people in the Eastern Cape. So her foretold destruction did come to pass, but not in the way that she envisioned. And you can see here a rather poor quality image, but an extract of a painting from Andrew Hlangwini about the prophecy of the cattle killing. So who was this woman, Nonkaouse, the prophet? She was aged around 15 or 16 in the Eastern Cape region. She was a young person who was cared for by a domineering uncle, and these prophecies have been either blamed or allocated at least to her stories for spurring on this cattle killing and the burning of crops in the 1850s. So a little bit of cultural context there. Under the indigenous spirituality, cows are slaughtered to summon the ancestors' protection, which at the time was thought to have been needed because of devastation by colonial troops, land grabs, and some poor leadership from the Xhosa kings. Her prophecy was a form of Judgment Day, saying a line such as, "The dead would arise and justice would be done." So I just found a couple of examples of recent books written about Nonkaouse. And one is by Trave Nicholas, who says he's a background as a research scientist and now writer. There was nothing more specific than that, but the claim that he's making in this book was that, in fact, there was also a devastating cattle disease that arrived from Europe into the Xhosa territories in the mid-1850s, and that this, in fact, was the contributory factor in the mass slaughter of cattle and the subsequent undermining of their society. So, in fact, it became a kind of imported disaster rather than one that was simply on the basis of this young person's prophecy. And in another book by J.J. Klaas, who was a sociologist and historian, he notes the correlation between the rapid spread of the cattle lung sickness and this cattle culling, with the quote, "The false colonial narrative of Nonqawuse created deep-seated psychological scars of shame, self-hatred, and a mental inferiority complex." So this becomes a kind of, at the same time, a culturally significant figure, but also a figure that sort of holds a lot of the shame and further degradation of the whole culture within the context of coloniality. And then just I realized while looking into Nonqawuse a bit further that other sources have also said there's contestation about whether she was an active agent, whether her prophecies came from the ancestors, or whether she was manipulated by her uncle. Okay, so we've got a kind of drama here played out at a mass scale with mass death, but also with this kind of interesting intrigue of belief, culture, and prophecy. So I thought it might be useful to think about how this figure has come into my research. So one example recently from 2023 was translating this concept to food systems. And in the images you can see here, there's a few performers with a big rope attached and wound around one of the figures. And they're using a lot of physicality in the three images. This was a collaboration with FSNet Africa, which is Food Systems Network Africa. Several of the PIs and investigators leading on that research were from the University of Leeds, as well as the University of Pretoria. And I was brought in to work with a group of community artists to make a piece of work that could be shared about the findings that some of their postdoc researchers were exploring. Many of whom were thinking about community uncertainty about changing crops to drought-resistant indigenous crops. And this is not just a matter of scientific relevance or resonance, but also about changing hearts and minds. So that's where I guess where the theatre intervention came in. But also to combat misinformation. So many people might be able to recognize, okay, there's a good reason why we need to change a regime, for example, or to rotate crops. But a lot of times, local and subsistence farmers don't have the scientific knowledge base to follow the science. So part of what we were doing was thinking about and working with this idea of someone who has knowledge, who's understood by the community to be a seer, who's challenging their sense of uncertainty and attitudes to change. And this piece was initially performed with policymakers, farmers, and communities, in particular at a very important conference for the FSNet Africa team. So just to rely on that paper by Wang et al., what I'm taking from it as a non-scientist is the interpretation of data beyond the usual timeline. So beyond the temporalities that we might usually be looking at. So in other words, the idea of the early warning signal. And a quote there from the paper is a sense of or form of recognition of sparse evidence that is not yet definitive, but nonetheless supports efforts to anticipate what they call tipping points or critical transitions in social ecological systems. So how does this come into the humanities and social sciences? To me, this is really a question of how we can see flickering within communities who are looking for social change. In other words, recognizing what needs to change in society and rising up or resisting, or refusing to produce the conditions of what they are foreseeing. And in social movement studies, which is also one of my areas of interest and research, this is called prefiguration. And there's some names that I could speak about there in the questions. But just for a quick definition, prefiguration is a practice, an embodied process of reimagining all of society. And as such, the specific practice of prefiguration is different every time and in each place that it is enacted. And this is a definition from Mackelberg. So, bringing this into ideas of arts activism. In my view, arts activists produce powerful imagery that thrust passers-by into the future implications of what they are facing. And maybe that's one of those troughs that Chris was showing on the graph. For example, climate catastrophe. Could that be the flickering? Perhaps it's not necessarily the data, as it is in the hard sciences or biology, or the early warning signal or the evidence of change. Maybe if we're thinking about prefiguration, it is the evidence of the need or the desire for change. So this kind of imagined future or anticipated future. If everything goes the way it is, what do we anticipate? So my question that arises from that is, what supports our capacity to register flickering in terms of social movements and arts activism? And the question I have is whether there is some relevance of audience here. So who is receiving this information, and how might attention to audience support wider take-up of early warning signals or flickering? So a couple of examples from climate catastrophe, neatly echoing one of Chris's images. You can see on the left an image from an XR intervention at a Malvern flood action, where they set up an office outside in a flooded street with signs saying things like business as usual around Storm Henk in 2024, January. And the sign says the Department for Organizing Climate Chaos. And then on the right-hand side, this is an image that was published in The Guardian from Bangladesh, where protesters are standing in a flooded field with signs. And to me, this one helps us to recognize inequity in how climate catastrophe affects the global majority. So from those initial examples, I have a couple of prompt questions for Chris and for our audience. So firstly, how do we receive the messages of flickering? What paradigm sets out the readiness to receive data of change? So here I'm thinking about Nonkause and her community who were culturally primed to see messages from the ancestors. So what is the form or legibility in relation to its cultural context? Do we reflect enough on how context inflects our interpretation? Whose warnings are listened to and how are their prophecies enacted? And here, this is really an epistemological question of what voices, hierarchies, and discourses are valued. And then, fourth question, when do the performances of flickering get contextualized by other disciplines or epistemic systems? And here, the question for all of us doing interdisciplinary work, what are the affordances of integrating across disciplines and epistemes? So, as I move to close, I'm going to pose specific questions for Chris, maybe from a biological perspective or ecology perspective, and anyone in the audience. Is flickering always a future-orientated potential pattern that is later made sense of or proven? What is the potential for different temporalities here? And I guess Chris has already mentioned scale and temporal difference there that could be super relevant, thinking across disciplines there. Can we keep culture and context in mind as critical to the issues of interpretation? And then to what extent does flickering need interdisciplinarity to support the sense making of complex patterns and what Wang et al. Have called the scarce data that may not yet be recognized in one paradigm? And just in case folks are interested in a particular example, I've given a note there for a reference, thinking with a couple of young people around the not yet future. So I will pause there and look forward to our questions. Thanks, folks.
Thank you very much, Ali. That's really interesting to have that different perspective and then link that together to what Chris talked about. I'm just going to ask Chris if he wants to come back on any of those questions initially that maybe speak to the things he was talking about from you, Ali. And then there's some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there are a lot of big, good questions there. I'll pull up on a couple that stuck with me. The first is receptiveness, which I think is a really interesting question, because there's parallels between your case study of your prophetess and the eco-apocalypse that conservation biologists have been going on about for a long time now. We, as a field, have been accused of identifying problems without solutions, and we keep saying there's a problem coming, and without it being immediate or obvious, we're not getting perhaps the attention that the field and the problem deserve, and that comes from non-linearity in the response, as I was trying to make clear, this notion of regime shifts. But I think that, yeah, the idea of both the audience and the generator of the messaging is a really interesting question that sits across both areas. The conservation biologists are extremely receptive. We are desperate for data and for evidence that we can use to make better ecological predictions. So yes, I think that's an interesting point. The other one was thinking about scarce data. The Wang paper is notable as one of the strongest examples of ecological time series and flickering. And what you'll note about it is that it starts in 1870. So we're in the situation where the best time to start an ecological study is 200 years ago, and the second best time is now. But we are not investing in the kinds of infrastructure we'd need in order to generate the data that would perhaps be useful in 100 years' time. So yes, the temporality question and data associated with that is significant. And then finally, the need for interdisciplinarity around addressing some of the issues with scarce data. Charlie Outhwaite's work is based almost entirely on citizen or community science. It is not people like me in lab coats wandering around counting insects and bryophytes. It's mostly the community recognizing that there is value in understanding the wider world. And so it is a socio-ecological data set rather than purely scientific. And there's a huge amount of wraparound study that's been done around why people engage with the environment through citizen science programs, what it means to be an environmental citizen, and just the real value of those kinds of data. When we look at the biodiversity data sets that the UK government uses to understand the state of nature in the UK, it's birds, butterflies, and moths, almost all of which are monitored by enthusiastic amateurs in their gardens. And I use enthusiastic amateurs with warmness and love for those people, because it's a terrible term. They're much more skilled than I am, but it's a skill set and a population that's undervalued. So I think there's an awful lot of great work that could be done to raise the profile of these kinds of data sets and adopt that kind of interdisciplinary approach to involving communities in a creative and productive way to understand change, for sure. So those are three thoughts, but there were lots of good questions that I've already forgotten. I'm happy to answer.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll go into the chat just to say to the audience, if you want to ask your question yourself, by all means do, if you can just raise your hand, but I'll read out the ones that have been posted in the chat for now. So first of all, Ajay asked, to what extent is it possible to identify flickering elements, aspects, parameters that could indicate potential future system change?
Shall I take that one? Maybe I can start. I think it's an open question across disciplines. Some disciplines are better developed in this space than others. There's a great paper which I'll try to dig out when I've finished yammering on, and I'll pop it into the chat, which has a table of different disciplines and their metrics that they use for looking at regime shifts. And so I think there's a certain amount of empirical work that shows that different types of time series responses, some of which are flickering, some of which are critical slowing down, some of which are increases in variability, that empirically they've been linked to shifts. The best evidence that we have is from the disciplines like chemistry and physics, where these things can be studied at very high resolutions in petri dishes and not computers. I think it gets less clear about identifying those links where you have more data sparse disciplines like ecology. And I don't know about creative and social sciences, Ali.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of one of my questions, at least when I started looking a bit further into Nonkaouse beyond our conversation initially, Chris, which was, you know, whether one always knows within the trough that's in that graph that is what's going to be happening, that either it's going to be a deeper trough and that means resilience, or that it's going to be flattening out, which means less chance for regime change, if I've understood correctly. So yeah, I think, you know, for example, in my other work, I'm looking at social movement studies, and, you know, oftentimes when people are deeply engaged in pursuing an alternative future that you know, we might hope or anticipate is going to be the case, and that's why I wanted to raise that question of potential or desire. Is that really interesting in terms of flickering, if we're thinking about human behavior and human agency there? But I suspect that AJ's question might be better answered by the sciences or folks in STEM. So maybe there's other comments that might support that.
Thank you, both of you. I just had a question that's linked to that, so I'm going to butt in with that. Is there with flickering, because you're going between two alternative states in whatever context that's applied to, is there a danger that you miss depending on when you record? So I guess it has to be across time, but you could almost use, Ali talks about misinformation. Is there almost a way that you can use flickering to answer the question in the way you want it answered, as long as you measure at the right point?
You could certainly sample to structure your data set in such a way that it would, yes, miss or observe the phenomena that you're interested in. Yeah, for sure. Yes, basically, yeah, it's easy to game a scientific experiment in that kind of way. It requires an understanding of the phenomenon to begin with, which I'm not sure we necessarily have. But certainly the sparser your sampling, the less likely you are to detect that early warning signal. I mean, yeah, it's interesting that there's a general move towards greater resolution of environmental monitoring. And then a certain gentleman in the US is pulling all of these marine buoys out of the water, which was part of a hundreds of millions of dollars oceanographic observation network, which might give us indications about oceanic currents, which is another slightly frightening tipping point with various problems associated with ocean circulations. So yes, you can certainly rig observations to miss critical information.
Thank you. Ali, I suppose it's harder to rig people in that way.
I mean, they pretty easy to manipulate in various contexts, but that's not necessarily something that I would tend to do in my own research. No.
Thank you. Someone's asked a question about, is anyone investigating flickering in the context of digital twins? I don't know if either of you have an answer to that, but someone has put a thumbs up, so I don't know if that means it is. Do either of you have any insight on that? Or
I'm very happy to defer because I don't know at all.
I would defer as well, but yeah, I mean, digital twins are really interesting. As far as I'm aware, they tend to be an imperfect representation of the real world. They attempt to be a twin, but they miss it. And I think it's the details and reality that probably give you the data that you need. So again, it comes down to how the velocity of the data that's coming through from that system that you're trying to represent in the digital space. And if your sampling and your structuring and your modeling isn't in the right configuration, it wouldn't necessarily represent in that digital representation, would be my thinking. But no, Kate, I actually don't know. If you're thinking about traffic systems, I'd be interested to hear the case that you're talking about.
Thank you. I'll maybe let Kate come back on that. So a question from Mark: how much is flickering in both examples rendered specifically by the lens and perspective that is brought to bear on the context in question? And is this lens primarily held by those in power or at least privileged positions? Ali, do you want to get this one first?
I might just kick off. I guess this is what made that figure of Nonkause kind of interesting to me when we first had that conversation, because from within the problem, which I suppose was people starting to panic about the mass death of cattle, this young woman produced the vision and the prophecy that then led to the mass cattle killing. So in that case, it wasn't necessarily the interpretation was being done by those in power, because she was just a young girl. But I was trying to suggest and argue that I think there is definitely a lens in question here, and in that example it was a cultural lens which allowed people to interpret the mass killing as, you know, resonant within their belief about the ancestors and the warnings and so on, rather than just another example of colonial destruction, which might, you know, would have been more accurate potentially.
Thanks, Ali. Chris?
It's a really interesting question. So from an environmental science perspective, obviously we think almost exclusively in terms of Western science and technology generated insights. So I'm thinking now I'm not well placed to speak to indigenous knowledge systems and how they vary from Western science. But my general impression is that they are more holistic and present a greater depth and breadth of understanding, but it tends to span a longer time horizon, because it might be an oral tradition, it might be a generational transmission of information. And so if you're thinking about the long term, as I've already said, with this case with the Wang paper on the diatoms, you need that duration of time of thinking and of knowledge to be able to detect the state transitions. But I don't know whether you would pick up on the flickering, those very high resolution events within a non-Western knowledge system. So when I think about power and environment, I tend to think about those two systems being often in tension. And I don't know how they would interact. I think that's an interesting question. So certainly we have a series of governments around the world that's trying to take technology first approaches to understanding problems. And that imposes quite a rigid lens on how we derive information about the environment. I don't know what the solution is to that.
Thank you, Chris. There's a question from Maggie. So first of all, to Chris, could you say more about continuity versus innovation, which relates to your graph, RE withering, ecological flickering? And then to both of you, how do you use, if you do, those ideas in your work?
Yeah, thanks, mate. Maybe I'll pick up on the first part and then I'll hand over to Ali for the second part. So continuity and innovation, when I'm thinking about long-term ecological change, as I just said, you need that. Ideally, what you have is a baseline against which you can compare current problems. We almost never have that. When we look back through our ecological time series, we tend only to be able to look back to the 1950s or 60s, where the agricultural revolution in Europe had already destroyed huge amounts of natural spaces. But the longer we can go back in time, the better the insights we can have about contemporary change. And that's why a continuity of data sets is really crucial. What we don't want to do is suddenly stop doing everything that we've done for 60 or 70 years in understanding the environment and pivot to an entirely different set of methods that might not be complementary, might not allow the continuity of that time series. That's the first point. The innovation comes in because we can recognize the deficiencies in those legacy methods while not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, while we can still retain the value of the long-term imperfect and introduce a short-term, which is in itself an imperfection, but perhaps higher resolution, more informative data set alongside. So and we had a project, just to give you an example, which was about insect declines in the UK, which tried to do just this. It was trying to make the most of existing data, but also generate new data sets to complement, to generate bigger picture, holistic approaches to how we understand insect declines in the UK.
Yeah, I might just do a little callback to Chris' slide there on the potential of using old data sets to new ends, or relying on new methods for innovation. I think that sort of addresses some of what Maggie's asking about there as well. And then just to use the example of that Food Systems Network project, making community performance with folks about attitudes and responses to the need to generate different attitudes, I suppose, to crop choice, and yeah, safer food systems, more secure food systems for uncertain futures. That there was really the tension between continuity and innovation. So as Chris was saying, we don't just want to wholeheartedly embrace innovation, which could just be, oh, there's this whole new thing that everyone suddenly has to adopt, because human nature is such that people need to come around to different behaviors and even food sources, because they might not be used to something, or they might not appreciate something. And so yeah, to me, the use of processes of theatre making, which is not just making a show, but using creative processes with communities to understand where do they sit on this spectrum between continuity and innovation. What are the issues that turn up for them across the spectrum? And always, by the way, I need to acknowledge, always working in collaboration with the people that are experts in this, rather than, I don't need to be an expert in the food system difference or the crop choice difference. That's why we do that in collaboration. But the work that turns out afterwards is something that can speak to people's uncertainty. So that's really through the process of making work together.
Thank you both. I am conscious of time. There is another quick question in the chat. How could scenario analyses be useful for moving from exploring historical or current states towards looking into potential future states? I don't know if either of you have a fairly quick response to that.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, the best example of this is climate science, where you have emissions pathways based around scenarios for governance. I don't think there are equivalents in ecology. There may be some being developed now. It's certainly interesting for exploring these problems. The issue is that it's often very hard to predict where that tipping point is, and so understanding these complex systems, it's not always possible to encapsulate the complexity within a scenario, would be my concern. And climate models do that in a very simple but computationally extensive way, is my understanding. It's a very well understood system.
Ali, sorry, were you gonna?
Yeah, just to note, this is maybe where a collaboration also is a viable opportunity there to bring in either a creative arts-based process, or working to, I guess, role play comes off as a bad word, but role play potential scenarios based on obviously expert data and what those scenarios might be like. So open to collaboration, folks, if anyone's interested.
I was going to say, it kind of speaks to that interdisciplinary piece, doesn't it, about scenarios have to incorporate everything. So on that note, I will bring the session to a close, because we are nearly at 12 o'clock. So thank you ever so much, Ali and Chris, for the presentations and the discussion. As someone's noted in the chat, really, really interesting discussion, and lots of potential opportunities there to maybe have more conversations about this.